With 2020 hindsight, I look back and can see that we could have made the sermon series on Moses as long as we wanted to make it. The story begins in Exodus, and it runs through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 4 big books in the Old Testament. Moses lived to be 120 years old. You're going to hear that in the text this morning. So it's a big story. It's a long story. But I always knew when we started this story, by the way, it's just been wonderful to see our children learning this story and making their burning bushes and so forth. But I always knew that we would finish this story with this 34th chapter of Deuteronomy, the last scene. So we begin with Moses being born and being set loose in a reed basket in the Nile in Egypt. And now we finish the story of Moses with him on the edge of the promised land and seeing the promised land before he dies. So this is really a great passage. I've always known we'd finish with this one because there's so much to learn from this particular 34th chapter of Deuteronomy as we look at the final days in the life of Moses. So we invite you to follow the reading in your pew Bible or on the screen. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land. Now, when we say the Lord showed him the whole land, we're talking about the promised land. This is the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the land they've been traveling towards through the wilderness. So he showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." He's saying this to Moses. I'm going to let you see the land with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is actually one of my very favorite passages in the Old Testament. I think it's a beautiful passage. This is the way I think of this last scene in Deuteronomy and this last scene in the life of Moses. After traveling all of these years through the wilderness, after all of the trouble, after all of the resentment and disobedience and rebelliousness on the part of the people, after 120 years of life, they get right there to the edge of the promised land. And God comes and gets Moses and says, "Moses, I want you to come with me." And he leads Moses up the side of a mountain. And when they get to the top, they look out there. And there is this beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. And God says, "Moses, you're not going to be able to cross over. But I want you to see what your life has been about. I want you to see what your journey has been about. Look out here. This is the story that you've been living for." And then I hear God saying, "Well done. Well done, good and faithful servant." The story of Moses is an extraordinary Moses. We've been asking various questions the last few weeks about what it means to live a life of faith and what Moses can teach us about a life of faith. And today, what I'd like to do is kind of look back at Moses and summarize what he stood for and how he lived and what it tells us about the life of purpose or the meaningful life, or what I like to say, the life well lived. What was it about Moses that made him and his story so very special? And what I'd like to say to you this morning is I've read through this story from Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy. What we find in the life of Moses is the life of a really ordinary human being. But I would say this about him: an ordinary human being who lived an exceptional life by being exceptionally faithful. We'll talk about this in just a moment, but the Bible is full of heroes. You can find heroes in Old Testament and New Testament as well. But what sets Moses apart, I think, is the fact that he was such an extraordinarily ordinary human being, a person of limited gifts, but a person of great faithfulness. And I'll have to say to you that as I started thinking about this sermon today, I started contrasting ordinary against extraordinary, and it occurs to me that we live in a world in which that which is merely ordinary is not celebrated at all. When I was growing up, at least in my family, we celebrated ordinary people, ordinary lives that were lived extremely well. Now, when I was a child, I grew up in the 50s, and we had black and white TV, and I remember, I loved watching, we had a superhero, watched Superman in black and white, the Lone Ranger, Roy Rogers. So I had my heroes on TV. But the people who were most powerful in my life were my father and my mother, my aunts and uncles, people who were members of the church, ordinary human beings who I sensed, even at that time, lived really extraordinary lives by just simply walking through life faithfully one day at a time. Today, I think we only celebrate the extraordinary, don't we? We live in a hyped-up world. We can agree about that, don't we? We live in a really hyped-up world, partly because it is so media-driven. I don't watch much TV today except for the news, but you turn on the TV. I did a little bit of a survey the other day. You turn on your television set these days, and almost all the programs are about really extraordinary people. Everybody on TV is either really, really beautiful or really handsome, or really, really rich, billionaires, or an extraordinarily gifted athlete. Or a superhero. They brought back the superheroes now. Supergirl, superheroes. Of course, if you're Donald Trump, you're all of those wrapped into one. I shouldn't have said that. I've been good. I couldn't resist that. But the truth of the matter is that I worry about our children. A number of years ago, I asked our youth director, who was here at the time, we were talking to him, and I was talking to him about our youth. And in this conversation, he said to me, what do you think the number one ambition of our youth is? Of the average youth, what's the number one ambition? What do they want to be? And I went through the list. I thought, well, maybe some of them want to be doctors or lawyers. They want to be an electrical engineer or a neurologist or something. He said the number one ambition of most of our youth is to simply be famous. To be famous. That is what has happened in our media-driven world. And frankly, it's all been exacerbated by social media, I think. And before I start talking about social media, let me just confess that I don't do it. It's primarily a matter of time. I have a Facebook account, but I don't know how to log on to it. Somebody here at the church runs it for me. They spare me the humiliation of knowing how many friends I don't have. I think I have a Twitter account as well, but I don't do any of that. But let me just say to you that I appreciate what social media has done. As a church, we're able to advertise in ways we could have never dreamed of, and much less expensively. We reach a lot of people in social media. Live streaming. We want to welcome all the people who are live streaming with us this morning. They're live streaming over in our modern service, Table of Grace. And we've discovered that we have people all over the country who live stream with us or worship with us by way of podcast in the middle of the week. We're going to have a social media experiment here in a minute. So I appreciate all the things that social media does, but let's be honest about this. At least from what people tell me, we have a way of kind of dressing up our Facebook account, posting pictures that indicate that our vacation was a lot better than your vacation, right? Or the party we went to was a lot more exciting than the party you went to. And I'm not really worried about adults who do this, but I can tell you this is an issue with our young people for whom social media has become a matter of constant competition. And a competition in which most of them don't feel very good about themselves because they're just ordinary teenagers. The story of Moses is such a wonderful story because he's such an ordinary person. The bush burst into flame. There's this wonderful epiphany or revelation of God. But you remember that Moses was a reluctant leader with few gifts. God said, I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to set my people free. And Moses said, I don't think so. I'm not gifted. I'm not a leader. I don't speak very well. But you know how the story continued. And God said, Moses, you're a part of a bigger story. It's important for you to go. And Moses did. So what we see in the life of Moses is the life of faithfulness lived by an ordinary person, but in exceptional ways, one day after the other. I want to talk about 3 ways in which he did that. Moses always listened to God before he spoke for God. Now, you can check this out if you want to take the time to read through those 4 books of the Old Testament: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Moses was constantly listening for the voice of God, and when he heard it, he was obedient to God. It's not always that easy for us, is it? Albert Aller was probably our greatest Methodist theologian since the days of John Wesley. He was a professor at Perkins School of Theology for many years. He's been dead for a number of years. I was fortunate I had one class with him. He was a brilliant man. But he loved telling this little story about sitting in on a homiletics class, a preaching class at Perkins. This was before the days of Alice McKenzie. And he said this first-year student got up to preach his first sermon in class, and he read the New Testament scripture, and he closed the Bible. And he said, now that's what Jesus had to say about this subject. Now here's what I've got to say about the subject. I've always thought that was kind of funny. It's a little bit backwards, isn't it? I mean, aren't we supposed to listen to Jesus before we start making our own opinions about it? But every time I think about that story, it kind of becomes a confessional moment for me. Because I have to admit that that's what my prayer life has looked like most of my life. Now, on the positive side, I was raised in the church, and I've said a prayer most of my life, every single day, most of my life, for the most part. But here's the bad news about how I've prayed every day, most of my life. I'll wake up in the morning and I'll say something like this: Dear God, I know you're wondering why I've called this meeting. But I've got a number of issues that we need to talk about. I've created a little bit of an agenda here. We'll go through, we'll talk about the agenda items that I've got here, and then at the end of our time together, I'll go ahead and give you your assignments. And so that's what we'll do. And look, the agenda isn't always a bad agenda. God, here's a list of the people that my loved ones that are suffering with a disease or something. I'm like a little help with them if you don't mind. Then it gets a bit more narcissistic. I've got a couple of projects at work that are really challenging for me. I'd like a little help with that. Don't forget, we've got this rain problem at Siete Ranch, if you don't mind taking care of that. So you just make the assignments. It has taken me most of my lifetime to discover the power of silence when it comes to prayer. I want to share something that I've learned. It may seem like such a truism to you, but it was so powerful for me. You can't hear somebody else when you're talking. I mean, if you're wanting to be in relationship with God, if you're wanting to have some kind of wisdom or guidance from God, you have to quit talking. It's only in silence that God has the opportunity to maybe whisper a word to you. So in the last quarter of my life, silence is really important. Listening for God rather than just handing out the assignments. The season of Lent is just 2 or 3 weeks away, and we're really going to talk a lot about this. I think the great thing about Lent, I've never had as much appreciation for Lent through the years as I do these days, and I think it's because Lent forces us, it disciplines us to think about God, to be silent for a while, and to listen for God. And so we're going to be doing that in Lent. We're going to have a theme called Simply ... God. We're going to talk about living life simply and getting rid of the extraneous in our lives so that we can be silent and listen for God. That's what Moses did. He was always focused on listening to God before he spoke for God. Second personality characteristic of Moses, and that is that he was tenacious and steadfast rather than heroic. Now, I mentioned earlier, we've got lots of great heroes in the Bible. If you thumb through the pages of the Old Testament there, you'll come to the story of Samson. It's not nearly as long as the story of Moses, but Samson, of course, we all know about Samson. Samson was famous and heroic because he was the strongest man in the world. Samson could pull down the pillars of the temple with his own arms. So he was a gifted human being. Thumb over to Samuel, you read about King David. King David was a brilliant man. I mean, you read the Psalms, he was a poet. He had great insight about the existential nature of what it means to be a human being and also about the power of God in our lives. He was obviously a great military leader and hero, and he was a great leader. The people loved him. He was a gifted man. Go to the New Testament, if you will. Read the letters of St. Paul. When you read St. Paul, you're not only reading the writing of a man of faith, but you're also reading the writing of a person who clearly has a higher intelligence. Paul was gifted and brilliant. So when we come back to Moses, we just see an ordinary man in lots of ways. And the power of his life and the power of his testimony to us was in the fact that he was ordinary. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, well, what do you mean he was ordinary? I saw the movie. Charlton Heston was Moses. Moses was Charlton Heston. He was a great hero, wasn't it? I mean, the parting of the Red Sea, that was Moses, parted the Red Sea. The tablets, the Ten Commandments coming down, Charlton Heston and Moses, they were heroic figures. Well, you're wrong. When you leave the movie version of Moses and go to the Old Testament version of Moses, what you discover is that all of the heroic acts, the great drama in the story of Moses, was simply the work of God. Moses was the communicator. Moses stood by, and God provided the drama. It is really an extraordinary story about a reluctant leader who was always listening for God. And in case you still doubt me, let me just suggest to you that if you pull out your Old Testament and you read the story from beginning to end, the first chapter of Exodus to the last chapter of Deuteronomy, through Exodus, through Leviticus, through Numbers, to the end of Deuteronomy, if you're tough enough to do that, you will discover that this is some of the dullest reading you will ever read. It's all about the everyday work of Moses, building up the people of God. It's just slogging through life one day at a time with people who oftentimes were rebellious or impetuous or difficult. When I was growing up in Dallas in the 50s and 60s, my grandfather, he died when I was 19 years old. My grandfather on my mother's side was a celebrated lawman, a peace officer. He'd been a Texas Ranger. He spent most of his life as a Dallas County deputy sheriff. I'd ride around with him in his unmarked car a lot, and he would take me to work with him down to the old red courthouse. So I spent a lot of time with him, and I know that everybody in Dallas knew him. Everybody in law enforcement or in government knew him. He was best known for the fact that early in his career, he and his partner arrested Clyde Barrow, sent him to the penitentiary. So when I knew him, he dressed as he always had. He wore a brown suit, a tie, always had a pistol under his coat. So I admired him a lot. He knew a lot of people. Everybody admired him. And I could remember one time talking to my grandmother. I was only 8 or 9 years old. But I remember saying to her, you know, Mom, I'm thinking that I may grow up and be a peace officer like Bert. We all called him Bert. I may grow up and be a peace officer like Bert. And I'll never forget what my grandmother said. She said, well, that would be fine if you wanted to do that. But you need to know that it's not all that exciting most of the time. It's not glamorous. Your grandfather has spent most of his life in stakeouts all night long, really cold or really hot, transferring prisoners. Most of the time, it's just really slow, dull, hard work, one day at a time. That was 60 years ago, and I still remember it. It made such an impression on me. And so I grew up watching how people worked, and I discovered that that's the way life is. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a peace officer or a minister or a professional football player. Most of life is just getting up and going to work and performing and being faithful one day at a time. And that's precisely what Moses did. A couple of weeks ago, I commented about C.S. Lewis and his children's story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and how C.S. Lewis said there is no such thing as children's literature, that if it's worth reading at all, it's literature that should be read by adults. And then when I was working on this sermon, I thought about that children's fable. We teach our children about the race between the tortoise and the hare. And I thought, you know what the story of Moses teaches us is that in the life of faith, whether you live to be 60 or 80 or 120, in the life of faith, it is the tortoise who always wins. The ordinary person who lives an exceptional life of faith by taking one step at a time. And then finally, this third thing about Moses. He understood, I think, in an extraordinary way, that his story was a part of a bigger story. When God came to him in the burning bush, God said, I want you to go to Egypt and set my people free. Moses, he was reluctant about that. And God just reminded him, these are your people. This is your story. You are a part of a great salvation story. And I think that once Moses did that, he made that commitment. And he knew that everything he did, every little thing he did in life, was not just for himself, it was because he was a part of a salvation story. Not just about him and God, but about him and God and everyone else. And so one day at a time, and in ordinary ways, he was extremely faithful. A few months ago, I commented about David Brooks. I like David Brooks. He wrote a book about a year ago called The Road to Character. And I talked about him a bit. He said, I actually did that because I arrived at this place in my life where I realized I've accumulated a lot of things that are valuable in the eyes of the world. I have degrees and job, and I have money, and I have a certain amount of fame. But he said, I wasn't happy about my inner life. And I wasn't sure that I really had great character. I wasn't even sure what character was. And so he started researching people who he believed had great character. St. Augustine, Dorothy, the great Catholic social worker, Dorothy Day, John Marshall, great human beings. Some of them were Christians, some of them were not. And so he wrote this book. They're really little biographies of all these different brilliant people. But this is what he says he learned about them. In every case, when he found a human being that had lived a life going towards character, a life of character, in every case, they had made a commitment to a vision or to a cause or to some kind of work that was so big they were never going to finish it. Never going to finish it. So it's worth remembering. David Brooks says if you want to live a life well, if you want to develop character, you have to find a cause or a vision or work that is so big you will never finish it. It can be a religious commitment. It can be a commitment to helping other people. And I think nobody illustrates that more than Moses. 120 years, from the moment he was at that burning bush to the very end, he was focused on the bigger picture. And so when God takes him up to the mountain, that was for him and that was for you and me as well. This is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to end our life at a moment where we realize we've come a long way, but the story is a lot bigger than you and me. It is God's story. On the second week, I think maybe the third week of this sermon series, we talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement of the 60s, and how the story of Moses became really emblematic for them in terms of their own struggle. They looked back at this story, Moses leading the people out of slavery, out of Egypt, through the very tough time in the wilderness. That's where they considered themselves to be in America, out of slavery, but in the wilderness. This was a story that meant so much to them. And so you remember that speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made the night before he was assassinated. There in Memphis, Tennessee, his followers gathered around, and he stood before them, and this is what he said. He said, "I've been to the top of the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid, because my story has been a part of God's story." That speech, of course, directly out of this 34th chapter of Deuteronomy. I've been to the top of the mountain and God has shown me the promised land. I know that I've done my part. So whatever happens, let it be. I've never been one of those preachers who thinks that you should just always focus on the end, on your death, on that last moment in your life. There are a lot of preachers, there are a lot of religious people that think that's what it's all about. Just make sure you do whatever you need to do to get to heaven. I've never believed that, because I think the life of faith encourages us and teaches how to live a vibrant, purposeful, passionate life in the here and now, and that it should. But this much I do know. When you consider that final moment of your life, when you stop and think about what it might mean to be on the top of the mountain and looking at the work of God yet undone, it brings great clarity. It brings great clarity to how it is you want to end your life. And that brings great clarity to how it is you want to begin your life, or to continue your life if you're in the first quarter or the second quarter, or like me, in the third quarter of life. Most of us are just ordinary human beings, but we can live powerful and exceptional lives. And we can come to that moment where we stand on the mountain and we see the work yet unfinished, but we also hear those words, "Well done. Well done, good and faithful servant."